Hi everyone! Today I want to talk about the books that I recommend the most often. For years, among my friends, I've usually been the person that recommends books to other people. Even with my husband, I think I was recommending books to him by our first or second date, so I guess it's just kind of part of who I am. On the other hand, that does mean that nobody ever recommends books to me because I'm usually the one recommending to everyone else. So I spend a lot of time doing research and finding new things to try. That's one of the reasons that I was so excited to discover BookTube a few months ago, because it's a really great source to find recommendations from other people. But as I got this channel going, I thought that it would be a fun thing to do to take you guys through the list of books that I recommend the most often. These are not necessarily my all-time favorite books, although all of them are favorites and they're all books I love. But not all of the books that I would maybe rank in my top 10 of all time are books that I necessarily would recommend to other people, or that I think would be a good introduction to fantasy or science fiction, or that I think everyone will like. But all of the books that I'm going to talk about today are books that I recommend to other people all of the time. I also have one honorable mention of a book that I've actually tried to recommend to a bunch of people, and that either people haven't taken me up on, or that they've tried and haven't liked it. But I'm going to keep trying because I think it's an awesome book. The book that I recommend probably the most often is the first Mistborn book. It's called Mistborn: The Final Empire, but I think it has sort of been retroactively decided that The Final Empire is a confusing title for the first book in a trilogy, so I almost never hear people refer to it by that title. But you guys probably know that I love Brandon Sanderson, and I think that this is a great place to start. I think that the Stormlight Archive is probably his best work, but on the other hand, for people that haven't read a lot of fantasy, or who just are not sure about starting a new author with a 1,000-page book that leads to more 1,000-page books, I think the Stormlight Archive would look pretty daunting, and I think Mistborn is a very accessible place to start. The story is based around more of a heist, and there's a really engaging cast of characters, but Mistborn still encapsulates a lot of the things that I think are really great about Sanderson's writing. First of all, he really has a goal of what he likes to call transparent prose, which basically means that while you're reading it, you're just so sucked into the story and you're not even really noticing what it is that you're reading. So it's not necessarily a literary experience, but it's great storytelling. He's also known for his magic systems, and Mistborn is probably still the best example of this, although the magic systems in the Stormlight Archive are gradually getting more fleshed out. But in Mistborn, the magic system is really well developed, and it's built around the characters consuming and being able to use different metals to get different powers. I think that the Mistborn trilogy is a really great place to start for people who haven't read a lot of fantasy, or who haven't read a fantasy book that was written after like the year 2000. Mistborn was also the first book I ever read by Brandon Sanderson, which was more than 10 years ago at this point, and I still feel like it's a really good place to start with the Cosmere. I'm actually planning to reread the Mistborn trilogy as part of my big Cosmere reread, so you'll probably hear me talk more about it soon. Another epic fantasy book that I recommend all the time is The Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss. I think I've mentioned before that this book is the book that got me back into reading fantasy after a lull of several years back in 2008. So I will always love this book, and it has a really special place in my heart. For people that want a reading experience that is a little more traditional fantasy, or that is a little more literary, I think that The Name of the Wind is a really great book for them. We all know that Patrick Rothfuss really slaves over every sentence in his books, and that's why we've been waiting almost 10 years for the third book in the trilogy, but even so, it's really beautiful writing, and I always enjoy his writing style. Also, as a musician, I think that he has done better than any other author that I've ever read in capturing what it's like to be a musician, because Kavoth, his main character, is, among other things, a musician. He plays the lute. So even though Rothfuss isn't a musician himself, the way that he writes about what it's like to perform and even to practice is just really close to home. I've never read another author that captured it quite so well, even books that were more specifically about music, or books that were supposed to be about musicians. I probably don't recommend this book quite as often as I recommend Mistborn, even though I do love it. First of all, Rothfuss doesn't have the same body of work that Sanderson does in terms of being something that you can really get into. We're still waiting for book 3 in the trilogy, obviously. And also, I feel like this is a book that won't necessarily appeal to people that don't already have some draw to more classic epic fantasy. I mean, there is a frame story set in an inn, for example. There are a lot of traditional tropes in this book. I just think it's done really, really well. In terms of just sheer love for a series, there are very few series I love as much as I love the Vorkosigan Saga by Lois, McMaster, Bujold. Here I have a bind-up of the first 2 books in the sort of main sequence of the series. I don't love the later books in the series quite so much, but in terms of the main series, there are at least 10 or 11 books that I absolutely adore. I can't think of very many series where I feel like I know the characters so well or really love them as much as I love the characters in this series. Somehow, she manages to transition the series about halfway through from being more military adventure space opera to being more detective stories, and there's even a comedy of manners thrown in there towards the end. Miles Vorkosigan, who is the protagonist for most of the series, is one of the most iconic characters I can think of. Miles is amazing and hilarious and kind of overpowers everyone that he comes into contact through with just the strength of his will. He's also one of the only characters, maybe the only character with a disability that I can think of that I've seen just handled really, really well in fiction. I usually either recommend starting the series with this. The first book with Miles is called The Warrior's Apprentice, but there are also 2 prequel books featuring Miles' parents. The first one of those is called Shards of Honor. So depending on who I'm recommending to, I usually recommend starting with one of those books. It really depends on the reader. For example, I just sent a copy of The Warrior's Apprentice to my 16-year-old nephew. I feel like he's going to relate better to that book because it has a young male protagonist and is a little more adventure-based. Shards of Honor, which is the first book, is from the point of view of Miles' mother, Cordelia, and so it has a little more romance in it. It's about the relationship between Miles' parents, and it also has a slightly older female protagonist. I think they're both really great books, and I think if you're reading the series, you should read the prequels eventually, even if you don't start with them, but it just depends on what you're more interested in. Honestly, I think that Shards of Honor is probably actually one of the best romance stories that I've ever read, even though, of course, it has other elements to the plot as well. So I think readers that would connect better to a younger protagonist or just a more straightforward adventure story should definitely start with The Warrior's Apprentice, but if it's someone that I think would connect more to the romance or to having a female character, I think that Shards of Honor is a good place to start. Either way, you can't go wrong with Vorkosigan Saga. I cannot recommend it highly enough. Another book that I have loved for many, many years is Good Omens by Neal Gaiman and Terry Pratchett. I know the show came out recently. I actually loved the show. It was really, really faithful to the book. It added in a few things that the authors had planned to include in a sequel that they never wrote, and it did kind of update things a little bit for the modern day. There are some jokes in this book that depend on things like cassette tapes and answering machines that didn't quite work anymore. But other than that, it was a very faithful adaptation. I don't even think it's a problem if you watch the show before you read the book. But I love this book so much. It's kind of funny because I have not really read that much by either author. I think I've read a few Discworld books by Terry Pratchett. I like Terry Pratchett. I don't adore Terry Pratchett, but I think he's really funny and a good writer and clever. And when it comes to Neal Gaiman, I am still very traumatized from a read of American Gods when I was in my teens. I know I probably need to try more Neal Gaiman someday, but I just haven't gotten around to it yet. But somehow when these authors combined, this book is just pure magic. It is so funny. The tagline is that an angel and a demon are teaming up together to prevent the apocalypse, but that doesn't even do it justice. It's a very, very funny book. Another book that I think is very entertaining and honestly pretty absurd is To Say Nothing of the Dog by Connie Willis. Connie Willis is another one of my favorite authors, and I've read some of her standalones, but really the crown jewel in her writing, in my opinion, is her books. There isn't a formal series name, but they're in a sequence of books that are about time-traveling historians from Oxford in the future, and they are more loosely connected. There's some overlap, but each book, or there's one duology, are pretty much their own thing. The first book in this sequence that she wrote was Doomsday Book. It is about a young historian on her first assignment who gets stuck back in the times of the Black Plague, while meanwhile in, I think, 22nd century England, there is a pandemic going on. This is a little too timely for right now, unfortunately, but actually usually the book I recommend that people start with is this one, To Say Nothing of the Dog, which is totally different in tone. It's very funny. It's kind of an ode to the Victorian era and Victorian literature and traditional mysteries, and it's a very funny time travel story. So this is a pretty entertaining light read, although the other books in this series are slightly darker. I'm going to move away from fantasy and science fiction briefly, just for a couple of books, and talk about a few other things that I like to recommend. I do have a soft spot for mystery series, as you may have noticed, and one series that I really like to recommend is the Amelia Peabody series by Elizabeth Peters. The first one is The Crocodile on the Sandbank, which introduces us to our heroes. This is also a very funny series. It's set ranging from late Victorian era to just past World War I. The main characters are Egyptologists, so they are doing excavations in Egypt, and pretty much every season they have another dead body or some mystery that they need to solve. Most of the series is narrated by Amelia Peabody, although there are a few other perspectives later on. She is a hilarious detective and narrator because she's really independent, stubborn, opinionated, and she always thinks that she knows what's going on, even when she is totally wrong. And we have a pretty clear sense of her as an unreliable narrator while we're reading from her perspective. This is a very funny and lovable series, and a lot of people have really enjoyed it. I even got my parents to enjoy this series, which is a pretty big feat because I do not necessarily always share reading taste with them in all things, although they do have great taste in the books that they read. So if you want to try a mystery series, or you want to take a break from fantasy, or you're somehow watching this even though you don't like fantasy, which is hard to believe, try The Crocodile on the Sandbank by Elizabeth Peters. Another one of my favorite authors is Kazuo Ishiguro. He is a pretty famous author. He won the Nobel Prize for Literature a few years ago. You've probably heard of him. His most famous book was probably Remains of the Day, which won a Booker Prize when it came out, and which was also a pretty well-known movie in the early 90s. His more recent book, Never Let Me Go, which is kind of science fiction, also had a movie made of it and was pretty successful in more recent years. But my favorite book by him is actually An Artist of the Floating World, which is really similar to Remains of the Day in many ways, but I have always found it to be a somewhat more compelling book. And I know this is a lesser work by a really well-known author, but I think it might still be the best thing he's written. It is similarly to Remains of the Day, dealing with the aftermath of World War II. It's from the perspective of a Japanese artist who worked during the war to create propaganda, and he is kind of tormented by some of the things that he did and the decisions he made. But like most of Ishiguro's work, this is a very slow, literary, beautifully written, contemplative book with an unreliable narrator, so it's a little bit hard to talk about. It's not entirely a straightforward book, but it's very poetic and beautiful and powerful, and if you want to read more literary fiction, I highly recommend it. Or if you're thinking of reading Remains of the Day or something else by Ishiguro, honestly, I just really like this book by him. And now I promised I was going to do an honorable mention for most recommended books. The honorable mention goes to Anathem by Neal Stephenson. This is a book that I've recommended to so many people, and I think my husband is the only one who has actually read it, or maybe he's just the only one who has actually liked it. I do like Neal Stephenson, but Anathem is by far my favorite thing that he's written. Unfortunately, it's a very long book where the characters have a lot of philosophical dialogues. In fact, most of the characters are basically these monks in a world where education and scholarship has been largely confined to basically these cloistered monasteries. And the book is very immersive. It uses a ton of language that you either have to look in the glossary to understand or you kind of come to understand during the course of the book, but it's not an easy book to get into. There's a lot of philosophy and challenging ideas in it, and it just takes a long time to get through. But I've read it twice, I've listened to the audiobook twice, I've cried every time. I think it's an amazing book, but I should probably stop recommending it to people because it's just kind of overwhelming and daunting. But let me know if you've read it and if you like it, or maybe I should keep on. Maybe I'll find somebody else that loves this book as much as I do. So those were all of my most frequently recommended books. Please let me know down in the comments if there are any books that you recommend all the time to other people. Because like I said, one of the reasons why I felt excited about BookTube was the opportunity to get some book recommendations that I wasn't just going and finding for myself or by trial and error. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button and go ahead and subscribe if you want to see more videos from me.